The story of China's only female emperor does not begin with a scepter or a crown, but with a dark and persistent warning in the heart of the 7th century. During the early years of the Tang dynasty, the heavens were believed to be the ultimate judge of kings. It was a time of deep superstition, where a solar eclipse or a strange cloud could bring down a government. And it was in this atmosphere of fear that a prophecy began to whisper through the crowded, dusty streets of the capital Chang'an, a prophecy that would eventually shake the foundation of the empire. It said, "After 3 generations, a woman of the house of Wu shall rule as emperor, and the Tang dynasty shall be no more, in a society where women were seen as mere ornaments, as property to be traded in marriage, or as silent shadows behind heavy silk screens." This wasn't just a prophecy, it was a death warrant, a curse that threatened the bloodline of the Son of Heaven. Wu Zhou, the girl who would become Wu Zetian, was born into this dangerous world in 624 CE. Her family was wealthy, but they were not noble. Her father, Wu Shiwo, was a successful timber merchant, a man of sharp business instincts who had been a close friend and supporter of the dynasty's founder. Because of this, Wu grew up surrounded by luxury, but she also grew up in a household that valued the mind, unlike other fathers of that era, who prepared their daughters only for sewing, embroidery, and silence. Wu Shiwo did something radical and life-changing. He saw the fire in his daughter's eyes, her quick wit, and her relentless curiosity, and he encouraged her to read. He gave her access to his library, where she devoured books on high politics, on ancient history, and on complex military strategy, while other girls her age were learning how to paint their faces and walk with tiny steps. Wu was learning how empires were built, how wars were won through deception, and why great dynasties eventually crumbled into the dust. She studied the art of the court, the manipulation of law, and the heavy burden of the crown. But this golden childhood ended abruptly at the age of 14, when her father died, leaving his family unprotected. Her half-brothers, who had always resented Wu and her mother for their intelligence and their status, turned on them with unimaginable cruelty. They saw them as burdens to be discarded, as outsiders in their own home. It was in these months of humiliation and grief that Wu Zetian learned her first and most important lesson. She realized that in a world governed by men, beauty and intellect were useless without the shield of absolute power. She saw how icily the weak were crushed, and she made a silent iron vow that she would never, ever be weak again when the imperial summons finally arrived, calling her to the Forbidden City to join the harem of Emperor Taizong as a low-ranking concubine. Her mother was devastated. She wept bitter tears, fearing that her young daughter would be lost forever in the dark, competitive labyrinth of the palace. She feared that Wu would be consumed by the jealousy of other women or forgotten in a lonely room. But Wu Zhou did not shed a single tear. She looked at her mother with a gaze that was cold, focused, and terrifyingly ambitious. She said, "Mother, how do you know it is not my good fortune to finally meet the Son of Heaven?" At the age of 14, she walked through the massive, blood-red gates of the Forbidden City, leaving her childhood behind forever. She was entering a world of 3,000 women, a sea of silk and jade, where every woman was competing for a single glance, a single night with the Emperor. It was a place of hidden daggers, poisoned wine, and eunuchs who knew every secret. Most women in the harem lived their lives in a slow, agonizing silence, waiting for a call that never came. But Wu Zhou was not there to wait. She was there to observe. She was there to study the Emperor Taizong, the legendary warrior king. She watched from the corners of the court how he spoke to his generals, how he detected lies in his ministers, and how he sat upon the dragon throne with a power that seemed to command the very sun and moon. She realized that to gain his attention, she had to be more than just a beautiful face. She had to be a mirror to his own soul. A legend from those early years tells of a wild black horse named Lion Stallion, a beast so fierce and untamable that even the bravest soldiers of the guard could not ride it. The emperor, frustrated by the lack of courage in his men, asked his court for a solution. The young Wu, barely a woman, stepped forward into the circle of power and said, "I can tame him, but I will need 3 things. An iron whip, an iron hammer, and a sharp dagger first. I will lash him with the whip to show him my strength if he does not obey. I will strike him between the eyes with the iron hammer to show him my authority. And if he still does not obey, I will cut his throat." The court fell into a deathly silence. The emperor was shocked, but in that moment, he saw in this young concubine a ruthlessness and a clarity of purpose that mirrored his own. He gave her the name Minyang, which means the charming one. But while she had gained his respect, she had not yet gained his heart in a way that would secure her future. Taizong was an aging lion. His strength was fading, and Wu knew the brutal law of the harem. If an emperor died and a concubine had not given him a son, she would be sent to a Buddhist convent, her head would be shaved, and she would be forced to live as a nun in cold silence for the rest of her life. This would be a living death, a burial of her ambition. To prevent this, Wu Zhou began the most dangerous gamble of her life. She turned her attention away from the dying father and toward the young, gentle Prince Li Zhao, the future Emperor Gaozong. It was a forbidden, illicit connection, a crime of incest in the eyes of the law that carried the penalty of a slow and painful execution. But Wu was a master of the long game. She saw in the young prince a man who was soft, a man who needed a strong hand to guide him. She wasn't just seeking a lover. She was seeking a path back to the throne. She spent hours with him, talking of poetry, of history, and of the future, making herself indispensable to his soul as Taizong's health collapsed, and the palace began to smell of medicine and incense for the dead. Wu Zhao was already weaving the intricate web that would catch the next son of heaven. She understood that in the Forbidden City, the distance between the throne and the grave was thinner than a silk thread, and she was prepared to walk that line. No matter how much blood it required, the merchant's daughter was gone, and the architect of an empire had finally been born. In the summer of 649 CE, the great Emperor Taizong breathed his last, and the massive bells of the Forbidden City tolled 30,000 times, signaling the end of an era. But for Wu Zhao, each toll of the bells sounded like a hammer hitting her own coffin. As the palace prepared for the grand funeral, the brutal machinery of tradition began to turn. As per the ancient laws of the Tang Dynasty, all childless concubines of the deceased emperor were to be removed from the palace immediately. They were no longer seen as women, but as relics of a dead man's life. Wu and dozens of others were marched out of the red gates, their silk robes replaced with coarse, grey cloth, in a ceremony that was designed to strip them of their humanity. Their long, black, flowing hair, which was the ultimate symbol of their beauty and their status, was shaved off by the cold. Sharp blades of the palace barbers. Imagine Wu Zhao, the woman who had dared to dream of the dragon throne, standing in the cold wind as her hair fell to the dirt. She was sent to the Garnier Temple, a place of silence. of stone walls, and of endless, repetitive chanting for any other woman. This was the end of the world, a living burial where they would fade away in poverty and be forgotten by history. But Wu Zhao was not any other woman. She spent her days in the temple, not in true prayer to the Buddha, but in a state of cold, calculated waiting. She wore the grey robes, and she chanted the sutras, but her mind was back in the palace. She knew that the seed of obsession she had planted in the heart of the new emperor, Gaozong, would eventually grow. She knew his weakness, his loneliness, and his need for her strength for 2 long, agonizing years. She lived in that temple, enduring the hunger, the cold, and the monotonous life of a nun. She watched as other women lost their minds or accepted their fate. But Wu used the silence to sharpen her resolve. She was like a blade being tempered in the fire, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment finally arrived on the anniversary of Taizong's death, when Emperor Gaozong visited the Ganye temple to burn incense and honor his father's memory. History tells us that when their eyes met, the world around them disappeared. Wu did not approach him with pride. She approached him with a calculated, beautiful despair. She let her tears fall like pearls, making him feel that he was her only light in a world of darkness. Gaozong, a man of a much softer and more emotional nature than his father, was overwhelmed by grief and desire. He saw in this shorn nun the only woman who truly understood his soul. But bringing her back to the palace was a scandal. It was an act that defied the laws of heaven and earth. It was here that the ultimate irony of Wu's life took place. The current Empress Wang, who was locked in a bitter and losing struggle for power with another favorite concubine, Consort Zhou, made a move of staggering political blindness. She thought she could use Wu Zhao as a weapon to distract the emperor from her rival. She thought that Wu, a woman with no family backing and a shaven head, would be a grateful puppet she could control. Empress Wang herself arranged for Wu's return to the palace. She paid for her hair to be grown back. She provided the finest silks, and she convinced the court that Wu was needed as a lady-in-waiting. Empress Wang thought she was bringing in a tool, a minor distraction. She had no idea that she was opening the Shire gates for a dragon that would eventually consume her. Wu returned to the Forbidden City with a secret, terrifying vow. She would never, ever let a blade touch her hair again unless it was to crown her as the master of all China. She began her second life in the palace with a mask of perfect humility. She was the Empress's most loyal shadow. She was helpful, she was kind, and she was invisible when she needed to be. She worked quietly to eliminate the influence of Consort Zhou, using her intelligence to turn the emperor's heart away from her rival. But while the empress watched the harem, Wu Zhao was watching the entire empire. She used her personal funds and the emperor's lavish gifts to build the most sophisticated intelligence network the palace had ever seen. She bribed the eunuchs who cleaned the hallways, the maids who carried the tea, and the guards who stood at the doors. The people who were treated like furniture by the noble families became Wu's eyes and ears. She became the ear of the palace. She knew which minister was taking bribes, which general was drinking too much, and which concubine was whispering secrets in the dark. She realized that in the Forbidden City, information was more powerful than an army of 10,000 men. By the time Empress Wang realized that her puppet had become a master, it was already too late to stop her. Wu Xiao had given birth to a son, a prince of the blood, and she was no longer just a concubine. She was a mother, she was a player, and she was ready to move from the shadows of the harem to the very heart of the dragon throne. She looked at the empress, the woman who had brought her back, and she saw not a benefactor, but an obstacle, and in Wu's world, obstacles were not negotiated with, they were removed. No matter how much blood had to be spilled to do it, by the year 654 CE, the palace of Chang'an had become a pressure cooker of ambition and hatred. Wu Zhou was no longer the humble nun from the Garnier temple. She had become a force that could not be ignored. She was the emperor's favorite, the mother of his sons, and the shadow that followed his every move, but in the forbidden city. Being loved by the emperor was not enough to be secure. Empress Wang still held the title. She still held the ancient prestige of her noble family, and she was determined to crush this merchant's daughter who had stolen her husband's heart. The empress and consort Zhou, once bitter enemies, had now joined forces in a desperate alliance to destroy Wu. They whispered to the emperor that Wu was a witch, that she used dark magic to enchant him, and that her ambition would bring ruin to the Tang dynasty. Wu Zhou knew that as long as Empress Wang sat on the throne, her own life and the lives of her children were hanging by a thread. She needed a move so devastating that it would not only remove the empress, but erase her from history forever. And it was in this moment of extreme pressure that one of the most chilling events in human history took place. In the spring of that year, Wu Zhou gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. The emperor was overjoyed, and even the empress, hoping to mend fences or perhaps just to follow protocol, came to the nursery to visit the infant. History tells us that Empress Wang spent a few moments alone with the child, cooing over her before leaving the room. Shortly after she departed, Wu Zhou entered the nursery. What happened next is a secret that the cold stones of the palace have kept for centuries, but the traditional chronicles tell a story that makes the blood run cold. It is said that Wu Zhou, looking at her own flesh and blood, saw not a daughter but a golden opportunity. She reached down and with her own hands, she strangled the life out of the infant. She then covered the body and waited. When the emperor arrived a few minutes later to see his daughter, Wu greeted him with a smile, but when they uncovered the child, they found her cold and lifeless. Wu Zhou erupted into a performance of grief that would have put the greatest actors to shame. She wailed, she tore at her clothes, and she pointed the finger of blame directly at the only person who had just left the room. Empress Wang, the Emperor Gaozong, who was already weak and easily manipulated, was consumed by a blind, murderous rage. He could not believe his wife, the Empress, was capable of such a monstrous act, but the evidence was there, and Wu's tears were convincing. He accused the Empress of murdering the princess out of jealousy. The palace was thrown into chaos, the officials were shocked, and the nobility was silenced by the horror of the accusation. Wu Zhou had done the unthinkable. She had sacrificed her own child to win a political war. She understood that in the struggle for the dragon throne, there was no room for a mother's love, only for a ruler's cold calculation. From that day on, the fate of Empress Wang was sealed. The woman who had once been the master of the palace was now a prisoner in her own home, and the merchant's daughter was standing on the threshold of becoming the most powerful woman in the history of the world. She had paid the ultimate price for the crown, and she was prepared to make everyone else pay as well. The year 655 CE marked the final collapse of the old order in the Tang court. The Emperor Gaozong, fully under the spell of Wu Zhou and convinced of his wife's guilt, officially deposed Empress Wang. He stripped her of her titles, her dignity and her freedom, and in her place, he did what the entire nobility of China had feared. He crowned Wu Zhou as his new empress. The coronation was a spectacle of absolute power. Wu stood beside the emperor, draped in the heaviest silks and the most intricate jade, looking down at the ministers who had once mocked her father. But Wu was not satisfied with just the title. She knew that as long as Empress Wang and Consort Zhou were alive, even in prison, they were symbols of resistance. They were embers that could start a fire. She decided to extinguish them in a way that would send a message of terror to anyone who dared to dream of opposing her. The two fallen women were locked in a dark, narrow room in the depths of the palace, their windows boarded up, their only contact with the world a small hole through which food was passed. One day, the emperor, feeling a brief moment of pity, visited the prison and called out to them. They cried out for mercy, promising to be his loyal servants if only they were freed. When Wu Zhao heard of this visit, her fury was cold and absolute. She would not allow the emperor's weakness to undo her work. She ordered the guards to enter the prison and deliver a punishment that was so brutal it was recorded as a warning for generations to come. She ordered that Empress Wang and Consort Zhou be given 100 lashes each, until their skin was shredded and their bones were visible. But that was not the end. She then commanded that their hands and feet be cut off, and their mutilated bodies be thrown into large vats of high-proof wine. She famously said, "Now these two hags can get drunk to their bones." The screams of the two women echoed through the palace for days as they slowly died in agony. Before they perished, it is said that Consort Zhou cursed Wu, vowing that she would be reborn as a cat and Wu as a mouse, so that she could forever tear at Wu's throat. This curse terrified Wu Zhao for the rest of her life, and she famously banned cats from the palace for decades. But with their deaths, the last obstacles to her total control were gone. She began a systematic purge of the government. She created a secret police force, a network of informers who were encouraged to denounce anyone who spoke ill of the new empress. Thousands of officials, including some of the most respected statesmen of the era, were arrested, tortured, and executed. She replaced them with men of low birth, who owed everything to her, men who would never question her commands. She was no longer just the wife of the emperor, she was the power behind the throne. She began to sit behind a silk screen during the emperor's meetings, whispering his responses, making his decisions, and governing the empire in his name. The emperor's health, always fragile, began to fail under the pressure. He suffered from chronic headaches and bouts of blindness, leaving Wu to take the reins of the state completely. She was now the true son of heaven in all but name. The nobility was broken, the court was terrified, and the merchant's daughter had become the master of the dragon. She had turned the palace into a place of blood and wine, and she was just getting started by the year 660 CE. Wu Zhao was no longer just the empress. She was the undisputed architect of the Tang Empire. While the Emperor Gaozong suffered from mysterious illnesses, chronic dizziness, and failing eyesight, Wu moved from behind the silk screen into the blinding light of absolute rule. She knew that the old aristocracy, the noble families who had ruled China for centuries, still looked down upon her as an upstart. They whispered that a woman on the throne was a violation of the mandate of heaven. Wu's response was not to argue, but to annihilate. She realized that to maintain her position, she needed a power that did not rely on the emperor's love. She needed a shadow army. She created the world's first truly modern secret police, a network of thousands of informers that stretched from the highest ministerial offices to the smallest village tea houses. She placed large copper boxes in the capital, inviting any citizen to drop in a secret report or an accusation against their neighbors or superiors. Anonymity was guaranteed, and rewards were lavish for those who uncovered treason. This turned the empire into a place of permanent surveillance, where no one dared to trust their own family. She recruited men like Lei Zhongchen and Zhou, men who were experts in the art of pain. They developed a manual of torture that was so terrifying it was nicknamed the Manual of the 100 Agonies. They invented iron collars that slowly crushed the neck, and cages that prevented sleep for weeks. Thousands of noblemen, generals, and scholars were dragged to the interrogation chambers. Wu did not care if they were actually guilty. She only cared that they were removed as obstacles. She used these purges to wipe out the entire Li family, the very bloodline of the Tang dynasty, executing princes, their wives, and even their children to ensure that no rival could ever claim the throne. She was pruning the imperial family tree until only her own branch remained. But while she ruled through terror, she also understood the need for popular support. She lowered taxes for the peasants, redistributed land, and opened government positions to men of talent rather than just men of noble birth. She was building a new China, a China where everyone owed their lives and their wealth to her alone. She began to call herself and the emperor the two saints, sitting side by side in the great hall of state. She had successfully weaponized fear, and in doing so, she had become the most feared human being in the world. The merchant's daughter had transformed the dragon throne into a seat of iron and blood. As the 680s arrived, the Emperor Gaozong was a ghost of a man, a puppet whose strings were pulled by his wife. He was frequently blind and unable to attend to the business of the state. Many historians whisper that his prolonged illness was no accident, that Wu Zetian was slowly poisoning him with small, undetectable doses of lead or mercury to keep him incapacitated but alive enough to serve as her legal shield. But in 683 CE, the shield finally shattered. Gaozong died, leaving a vacuum of power that threatened to explode into civil war. Wu's eldest sons were now grown men, and according to the law, they were the rightful heirs to the empire. Her eldest son, Li Ji, was crowned as Emperor Zhongzong, but he made the fatal mistake of trying to exert his own will. He attempted to appoint his wife's father to a high position, a direct challenge to Wu's authority. His mother's response was swift and brutal. After only 6 weeks on the throne, Wu entered the Great Hall with her guards. She had the emperor dragged down from the throne in front of the entire court. She stripped him of his titles and sent him into internal exile. She then placed her younger, more submissive son, Li Dan, on the throne as Emperor Rizong. But Rizong was a prisoner in his own palace. He was not allowed to speak to officials. He was not allowed to leave his private quarters. And he was not allowed to make a single decision. Wu was now the sole regent, ruling with an authority that China had never seen. She moved the capital from Chang'an to Luoyang, a city she felt was more loyal to her, and she renamed it the Divine Capital. She began to wear the robes of an emperor. She performed the sacred sacrifices to heaven that were strictly reserved for men, and she began to rewrite the very religious fabric of China. She commissioned scholars to find or forge Buddhist sutras that predicted the arrival of a female deity who would rule the world of peace and prosperity. She was no longer content being a regent or a mother of kings. She was preparing the world for the unthinkable. She was preparing to declare herself the first and only female emperor of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty. She had spent 50 years fighting, seducing, and murdering her way to this moment. The emperor was dead, her sons were broken, and the dragon throne was waiting for its new master. She was 70 years old, but her hunger for power was as fresh as the day she first entered the palace gates. The mandate was now in her hands, and she would let no god or man take it from her. By the year 690 CE, the whispers of the past had become the loud declarations of the present. Zetian was 70 years old, an age where most rulers are preparing for the afterlife. But she was preparing for her greatest act of defiance. She was no longer content ruling through her sons. She saw them as weak, as shadows of the Temp's bloodline she had spent decades pruning. She decided to do what no woman in Chinese history had ever dared. She decided to take the dragon throne for herself, officially and eternally. She orchestrated a massive campaign of religious propaganda. Her scholars discovered a mysterious document called the Great Cloud Sutra, which spoke of a female deity, the Devi Vimala, who would be reincarnated as a female monarch to bring a golden age to the world. Wu declared herself this reincarnation. She was no longer just a human ruler, she was a living god. In a grand ceremony in the new capital of Luoyang, she forced her son, the puppet emperor Zhou, to officially abdicate and beg her to take the throne. She accepted with a calculated show of reluctance. She abolished the Tang dynasty and proclaimed the birth of her own dynasty, the Zhou, named after the ancient and glorious house of the past. She assumed the title of Huangdi, a title that specifically meant emperor, not empress consort or empress dowager, but the supreme male-gendered ruler. She wore the imperial yellow robes, the dragon crown, and performed the sacred rituals at the altar of heaven, where for thousands of years only men had stood. The world was stunned. The earth did not open to swallow her. The heavens did not strike her down. She had challenged the mandate of heaven and won. She was now the absolute master of over 50 million souls. Her word was the law of the universe. And she began to reshape China in her own image. She renamed the months, redesigned the characters of the Chinese language, and built a massive 300-foot-tall ceremonial tower called the Ming, the Hall of Enlightenment, to show the world that her power reached the very clouds. She had successfully turned a merchant's daughter into a living god, but she knew that the higher she climbed, the sharper the knives in the dark would become. The tanked loyalists were still out there, and they were waiting for her to stumble as the emperor of the new Zhou dynasty. Zetian knew that her biggest enemy was not an invading army, but the silence of the people she ruled. She knew that beneath the bows and the cheers, there was a simmering hatred among the old noble families. To combat this, she perfected the art of state-sponsored terror. She expanded her copper box system of secret denunciations until it became the primary way the government functioned. She empowered a group of men known as the cruel officials. Led by the infamous Lei Junshan, these men were not judges. They were monsters given legal authority. They developed torture devices with names like the Iron Maiden of the East and the Collar of Truth. They believed that everyone was a traitor, and they only needed enough pain to admit it during her reign. The interrogation rooms of Luoyang never slept. Thousands of people, from princes of the blood to lowly clerks, were arrested on the flimsiest evidence. Often a single anonymous letter dropped into a copper box was enough to destroy an entire family. She encouraged children to denounce their parents and wives to denounce their husbands, breaking the very foundation of Confucian society, which valued family loyalty above all else. She used this chaos to replace the old elite with a new class of officials. Men who rose through her reformed civil service exams, men who were scholars rather than soldiers, and who owed their entire existence to her. She was creating a meritocracy. But it was a meritocracy built on a foundation of corpses. The terror was so absolute that officials would bid their families a final goodbye every morning before leaving for court, not knowing if they would return alive. Wu watched all of this from her golden throne with a cold, detached eye. She believed that the stability of the empire required the blood of the ambitious, but the terror began to consume its own creators. Eventually, even her most loyal torturers, like Lei Junchen, grew too powerful and were executed by her order. She was the only one allowed to be a monster. She had created a world where everyone was a spy and everyone was a victim. But in the center of this web, she was increasingly lonely. She began to retreat further into her palace, surrounding herself with young, beautiful men, known as the North Gate Scholars and the Zhang brothers. She was seeking a youth she had lost to the struggle for power, but while she indulged in luxury, the Temp's loyalists were quietly gathering their strength in the shadows of the empire. The dragon was old, and the hunters were finally beginning to close in. By the late 690s, the Iron Empress was reaching her late 70s. Her body was finally showing signs of the decades spent in the service of absolute power. She was often bedridden, her health failing, and her mind increasingly isolated from the realities of the empire she had built. It was during this period of vulnerability that she fell under the influence of two brothers, Zhang Yizi and Zhang Changsong. They were young, incredibly beautiful, and masters of the art of seduction. The Zhang brothers were not just lovers. They became the gatekeepers of the Dragon Throne. They were given titles, immense wealth, and the power to control who could see the Empress. The court was horrified. Here was the woman who had tamed wild horses and crushed the most powerful nobleman in China, now being manipulated by two pretty boys who spent their days in the palace, wearing perfumes and playing musical instruments. The brothers used their position to build their own power base, selling government offices and intimidating any official who dared to question their authority. They became so bold that they even had members of the imperial family executed for speaking ill of them. The Empress, blinded by her affection and perhaps seeking a final refuge from the loneliness of her reign, refused to listen to any warnings about their corruption. The palace of Luoyang, once a place of terrifying discipline, became a place of decadent scandal. The Zheng brothers were like a cancer at the heart of the Zhou dynasty. Their presence alienated the very officials who had supported Wu's rise. The ministers saw that the Empress was no longer the sharp strategist she had once been. She was becoming a shadow, a prisoner of her own desires. And as the Zheng brothers' arrogance grew, so did the secret meetings in the dark corners of the capital. The Temp's loyalists, who had waited in silence for nearly 50 years, realized that the dragon was finally weak, and the time for the restoration of the Temp's bloodline had finally arrived. As the 8th century dawned, the tension in China reached a breaking point. The Zhang brothers had successfully isolated Wu Zetian from her most loyal advisors, but they could not stop the momentum of history, even within her own family. The desire for a return to the Tang dynasty was growing. Wu's sons, Li Ji and Li Dan, who had lived their lives as puppets and prisoners, were now seen as the only hope for a peaceful future. The old nobility, the scholarly elite, and even some of the secret police commanders began to form a clandestine alliance. They knew that if they didn't act soon, the Zhong brothers would eventually seize the throne for themselves after Wu's death, leading to a total collapse of the state. A group of powerful ministers, led by the legendary Zheng Jianzi, began to recruit the palace guards for a coup d'etat. It was a high-stakes game of life and death. If a single word of the plot leaked out, every conspirator and their entire families would be wiped out in the execution grounds of Lu. But the ministers were desperate. They saw an empire that was rotting from within, while its master was hidden behind silken curtains. They also began to win over the support of the army, convincing the generals that the mandate of heaven had finally left the house of Wu. The empress, meanwhile, was increasingly disconnected. She spent her days in the Hall of Great Light, listening to the Zhang brothers tell her stories of her own divinity. She believed her secret police still protected her, but she didn't realize that the very men who had once dropped reports into her copper boxes were now signing their names to her downfall. The atmosphere in the capital was thick with the scent of impending blood. Everyone knew that the reign of the only female emperor was coming to an end, and the only question left was how many people would die when the dragon throne was finally reclaimed. It was the cold morning of February 20th, 705 CE. A thick fog had settled over the city of Lujiang, masking the movement of 500 elite palace guards. Wu Zetian was 80 years old. Lying ill in her private chambers at the Hall of Great Light, she was guarded not by her generals, but by the Zhang brothers, who believed they were untouchable. But the silence of the palace was suddenly broken by the rhythmic thunder of iron boots. The conspirators, led by the veteran minister Zhang Jianzi, had finally moved. They did not come for the empress first. They came for her favorites. The Zhang brothers were caught in the hallway and executed on the spot. Their heads were severed and displayed as a sign that the reign of the pretty boys was over. When the guards finally burst into the empress's bedchamber, she sat up, her eyes still flashing with the old fire that had once tamed the lion stallion. She looked at the ministers and asked, "Is it you, Zhou Jianze, who leads this rebellion? I have treated you with such favor. Why are you here?" Zhong knelt, but his voice was iron. He replied, "The emperor is old, and the people long for the return of the Thames. We are here to serve the rightful heir." Wu Zetian looked at her son, Li Ji, who stood trembling behind the soldiers. She realized in that moment that the web she had spun for 50 years had finally caught her too. She was forced to abdicate the throne. The Zhou dynasty, which she had fought so hard to create, was abolished in a single day. She was moved to a smaller, secondary palace, stripped of her imperial yellow robes, and left with only a few attendants. The dragon was not killed, but it was caged. She spent her final months in a silence she had not known since the Garnier Temple, watching the snow fall over Luoyang, knowing that the Tang dynasty she had tried to erase was now back in power, erasing her every decree, her every character, and her very name from the official records. On December 16th, 705 CE, Wu Zetian breathed her last. She died not as an emperor, but as a deposed empress dowager. Her final request was simple yet mysterious. She asked to be buried beside her husband, Emperor Gaozong, in the Qinling Mausoleum. But she left one final, staggering command that would baffle historians for over 1,000 years. She ordered that her tombstone, a massive 18-foot-tall stone slab, be left completely blank. It is known to this day as the unmarked stele. For a woman who had spent her life redefining language and rewriting sutras, this final silence was her ultimate masterpiece. Some say she felt her achievements were too great for words. Others believe she knew that any words she wrote would be carved away by her enemies. She chose to let history be her judge for centuries. The Temps historians tried to paint her as a monster, a witch who murdered her children and stole a throne that belonged to men. They called her reign a dark interruption in the glorious Tang timeline. But the people of China remembered differently. They remembered the lower taxes, the flourishing trade on the Silk Road, and the meritocracy that allowed poor scholars to rise to power. Under her rule, China had been stable, wealthy, and feared by its neighbors. She had proven that a woman's hand could hold the dragon throne with more strength than any man. Today, as the sun sets over the Qinling Mausoleum, the blank stone stands as a testament to her audacity. She was the merchant's daughter, the shaven-headed nun, the murderous mother, and the divine sovereign she was wooed. The only woman to ever call herself Emperor of China. Her dynasty died with her, but her legend remains as a reminder that power has no gender, only the will to seize it and the intelligence to keep it. She came into the world as a prophecy of ruin, and she left it as a permanent scar on the face of history, a scar that no amount of time could ever fully heal. The sun has set on the Zhou dynasty, and the name of Wu Zetian has been carved out of the official records of the temps. But as you stand before the massive, silent stone of the Qinling Mausoleum, you realize that she won the final war. The war of memory. She knew that words could be rewritten, that history could be distorted by the pens of men who feared her. So she chose to say nothing at all. She left her stone blank, daring us to look at her life and judge for ourselves. Was she the monster that murdered her own children? Or was she the visionary who stabilized an empire and paved the way for the golden age of China? Perhaps she was both, a woman who understood that in the game of the dragon throne, there is no middle ground. There is only power and the will to hold it. As we close this chapter of history, we are left with the image of a merchant's daughter who defied the heavens, who tamed stallions and emperors alike, and who proved that a crown fits a woman just as heavily as a man. Thank you for joining us on this 2-hour journey through the dark heart of the Forbidden City. If you found this story of power and defiance gripping, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. Leave a comment below and let us know, do you think Wu Zetian was a hero or a villain? And whose story should we tell next? Until then, remember, history is not just about the dates we remember, but the silence we leave behind.